dusty road behind him had long since faded into the rearview mirror, replaced by the churning gray fury of the Gulf Coast sky, but the grit of 1,000 miles still felt settled deep in the lines of George Strait's face. The windshield wipers of his black truck fought a losing battle against the torrential downpour that hammered the glass, a rhythmic violence that mirrored the restless beating of his own heart. He had come to Galveston not for a concert, not for an award, and not for the applause that had defined the last 4 decades of his life, but for the silence that the ocean usually promised. Yet, tonight, the ocean was screaming. The historic Hotel Galvez rose from the mist like a grand, stranded vessel, its Spanish-style arches and white walls glowing faintly under the assault of the lightning that tore through the purple clouds. It was a place of ghosts, they said, a place where history refused to stay buried. And as George parked his truck, shielding his eyes against the stinging rain, he felt a heaviness settle upon his shoulders that had nothing to do with the humidity. He grabbed his guitar case from the passenger seat, the leather handle worn smooth by years of grip, and made a dash for the entrance. The wind howled, a mournful sound that seemed to carry the voices of sailors lost at sea, pushing him through the revolving doors and into the sudden, jarring stillness of the lobby. The air inside was cool, smelling of old mahogany, lemon polish, and the faint, underlying scent of salt that no amount of cleaning could ever truly scrub from the walls of a building that faced the sea. The lobby was empty, save for a young night manager standing behind the marble counter, his face pale in the dim light of the crystal chandeliers that flickered with every roll of thunder. The young man looked up, his eyes widening as he recognized the figure shaking the rain from his Stetson. It wasn't just a cowboy, it was the king. But George didn't look like a king tonight. He looked like a man searching for a place to rest his bones. George approached the desk, his boots clicking softly on the terrazzo floor. He didn't want fanfare. He kept his hat low. The young man, whose name tag read Arthur, swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his tie. He had grown up listening to George's voice on his father's radio in a small trailer in West Texas, and seeing the legend standing there, dripping wet and looking so profoundly human, struck a chord of reverence and fear in him. George asked for a room on the 3rd floor, specifically asking for something quiet, away from the elevators, away from the noise of the storm if possible. Arthur nodded quickly, typing into the computer with nervous fingers, explaining that the hotel was nearly empty due to the hurricane warning that had scared off the tourists. He handed George a heavy brass key, an old-fashioned touch that the hotel had kept for nostalgia, and told him he had been placed in room 302, a suite at the far end of the West Wing. George thanked him with that signature half-smile that usually charmed stadiums, but tonight it didn't reach his eyes. He took the key and the guitar, walking toward the elevators. As the doors closed, shutting out the lobby, George leaned his head back against the mirrored wall of the car, closing his eyes. He was tired. A weariness that went beyond the physical. He and Norma had been married for over 50 years, a lifetime of love that defied the odds of the entertainment industry. But lately, the weight of time felt heavier. She was safe at home, or so he told himself, but the separation anxiety that sometimes gripped him when he was on the road felt different tonight. It felt like a premonition. The elevator chimed, opening onto the 3rd floor. The corridor stretched out before him, long and lined with plush carpet that dampened every sound. The wall sconces cast pools of yellow light that left long stretches of shadow in between. The storm outside was muffled here, reduced to a low, vibrating hum that shook the window panes at the end of the hall. George walked slowly, the guitar case heavy in his hand. He passed room 301, then 302, but he didn't stop. He felt a pull, an inexplicable urge to walk further down the hall, toward the section of the hotel that he knew, from vague memories of past stays, was often less occupied. He walked past the linen closets, past the ice machine that hummed with a mechanical rattle, until he found himself standing in the middle of the dim corridor, alone. And then he saw it. It happened in the space between two heartbeats. The lightning flashed outside, illuminating the hallway through the far window, and in that brief electric burst of white light, the world tilted. About 30 feet ahead of him, a door stood ajar. It was the door to room 305. A soft, golden light, warmer and different from the electric sconces of the hallway, spilled out from the crack, pooling on the carpet. It was the color of candlelight, or the glow of a sunset in the hill country. George froze. He knew hotels. He knew that guests left doors open, that maids cleaned late. But this felt wrong. The air around him suddenly turned cold, dropping 10 degrees in a second, raising the hair on his forearms. From the shadows of the hallway, a figure stepped into that golden beam of light. George's breath hitched in his throat, a strangled sound that died before it could become a word. It was a woman. She was moving with a grace that was terrifyingly familiar, a light, dancing step that he had watched 1,000 times across kitchen floors and dance halls. She was wearing a blue dress, not just any blue dress. It was a cornflower blue sundress with small white daisies embroidered on the hem, a dress that had been packed away in a cedar chest for 40 years. It was the dress Norma had worn on their trip to Galveston in 1982, the year before everything in their lives exploded into superstardom, back when they were just George and Norma, trying to figure out how to pay the bills and raise a family. The woman turned slightly, her profile silhouetted against the golden light. The curve of her jaw, the way her hair was pulled back with a simple ribbon, the posture of her shoulders. It was Norma. But not the Norma of today, with the beautiful silver in her hair and the gentle lines of wisdom on her face. This was Norma from 1982, young, vibrant, alive with a terrifying youthfulness. She didn't look at George. She looked into the room, as if someone were waiting for her inside, and she smiled, a smile that George felt in the center of his chest like a physical blow. She stepped through the doorway, the blue fabric of her skirt swirling around the doorframe, and then, with a soft, definitive click, the door closed. The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, George couldn't move. His boots felt nailed to the floor. His mind, usually so pragmatic, so grounded in the realities of ranching and business, spun wildly. He blinked, expecting the vision to dissolve, expecting to wake up in his truck on the side of the road. But the hallway remained. The smell of ozone from the storm was still sharp in his nose. The door to room 305 was shut. "Norma!" The scream tore from his throat, raw and desperate. He dropped the guitar case. It hit the floor with a loud thud that echoed down the empty corridor. But George was already running. He sprinted the 30 feet, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He reached the door of room 305 and grabbed the brass knob with both hands, twisting it violently. It didn't budge. "Norma! Norma, open the door!" he shouted, pounding his fist against the wood. The wood felt cold, solid, and unyielding. It didn't feel like a door that had just been closed. It felt like a wall. He put his ear to the wood, listening for movement, for the sound of her voice, for the rustle of that blue dress. He heard nothing but the blood rushing in his own ears and the distant rumble of thunder. "Norma, it's me. It's George." He rattled the handle again, harder this time, using his shoulder to shove against the frame. The door held fast. It wasn't just locked, it felt fused. Panic, cold and sharp, began to rise in his chest. He turned and looked down the hallway, half expecting to see a maid, a guest, anyone who could confirm what he had just seen. The hallway was empty. He had to get inside. He needed a key. He remembered the young manager downstairs. George didn't wait for the elevator. He ran for the stairs, his boots clattering on the steps, taking them two at a time. He burst into the lobby, startling Arthur, who was in the middle of pouring himself a cup of coffee. The young man jumped, spilling the hot liquid on his hand, but he forgot the pain when he saw the look on George Strait's face. The calmness was gone. The cowboy stoicism was shattered. George looked wild, his eyes wide, his chest heaving. "I need the key," George demanded, marching up to the desk, his voice trembling with an intensity that made Arthur step back. "Right now, I need the key to room 305. Arthur stared at him, confused. "Mr. Straight, is everything all right? Did something happen in your room?" "Not my room," George snapped, slamming his hand on the marble counter. "Room 305. I need into room 305. My wife. I saw my wife go in there." Arthur's face went from confused to pale in an instant. He looked at the computer screen, then back at George, then down at the ledger on the desk. He licked his lips nervously. "Mr. Straight, there must be some mistake. Your wife isn't checked in. You checked in alone." "I know I checked in alone," George roared, his patience snapping. "I'm telling you what I saw. She's in there. She's in room 305. She's wearing a blue dress. I saw her walk in and close the door. Now give me the damn key before I kick it down." Arthur swallowed hard, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Mr. Straight, please, listen to me. I can't give you a key to room 305. "Why not? Is it occupied? I don't care who's in there. That was my wife." "No, sir," Arthur said, his voice shaking. "It's not occupied. Room 305 hasn't been occupied in 10 years. George froze. "What are you talking about?" Arthur came around the desk, his movements slow and cautious, as if approaching a wounded animal. "Sir, room 305. It was damaged during the flood a decade ago. The structural integrity of the balcony was compromised, and the interior suffered severe water damage. The hotel ownership decided it was too expensive to renovate at the time because of the historical preservation laws. They sealed it." "Sealed it?" George repeated, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "Yes, sir," Arthur said gently. "The lock is fused. The power to that room is cut. There is no keycard access, and the physical keyhole was filled with epoxy to prevent guests from accidentally trying to enter. Nobody has been inside room 305 since 2014. It's impossible." George stared at the young man. The logic was sound. The explanation was rational. But George knew what he had seen. He hadn't seen a ghost. He hadn't seen a flicker of light. He had seen Norma. He had seen the specific way her hand moved when she smoothed her skirt. He had seen the ribbon in her hair. That wasn't a trick of the light. That was a memory made flesh. "Come with me," George said, his voice low and dangerous. It wasn't a request. Arthur didn't argue. He grabbed a master set of keys, useless for that room, but perhaps comforting to hold, and a flashlight. Together, they rode the elevator in silence. When they reached the 3rd floor, George led the way. Walking with a grim determination back to the spot where he had dropped his guitar. He picked up the case and set it gently against the wall, then pointed at the door. "There," George said. "I saw her walk in there." Arthur approached the door cautiously. He shone his flashlight on the handle. It was old brass, tarnished and dull. And just as he had said, the keyhole was filled with a hardened, dark resin. It was completely blocked. Arthur pushed on the door. It was solid as a rock. He looked at the bottom of the door frame. A thick layer of dust had settled there, undisturbed. If someone had opened that door 5 minutes ago, the dust would be swept clean in an arc. It wasn't. "Mr. Straight," Arthur said softly, shining the light on the dust. "Look, the seal is unbroken. Nobody opened this door. Not tonight. Not for a long time." George looked at the dust. He looked at the epoxy in the lock. His rational mind, the mind that managed a multi-million-dollar career and a working ranch, told him that Arthur was right. It was physically impossible. But his heart, the heart that had written songs about love that transcends death and time, told him that the physical evidence was a lie. "I know what I saw," George whispered, the fight draining out of his voice, replaced by a terrifying vulnerability. "I saw her, son. She was young. She was wearing the dress she wore when we stayed here in '82. She looked happy." Arthur looked at the legendary singer, seeing the tears welling in eyes that had seen the world. He felt a pang of immense pity. He wondered if George was suffering from exhaustion, or perhaps something worse. Maybe it was a reflection. The storm makes the lights flicker. Shadows play tricks. George shook his head slowly. "I'm not leaving." "Sir?" "I'm not leaving this hallway," George said, walking over to a small, velvet-upholstered armchair that sat near the elevators. He dragged it across the carpet, the legs groaning against the fabric, until he placed it directly across from the door of room 305. "I'm going to sit right here. If she's in there, she has to come out." "Mr. Straight, you can't sleep in the hallway. You have a suite down the hall. It's comfortable. I can bring you some tea, maybe something to help you sleep." "I don't want to sleep," George said, sitting down in the chair. He placed his cowboy hat on his knee and stared at the door. "I want to know why my wife is in a room that doesn't exist." Arthur stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. He couldn't force George Straight to go to bed. He couldn't call the police on a national treasure who was simply sitting in a chair. I'll be at the desk if you need anything, sir," Arthur said finally. George didn't answer. He was already gone, his focus entirely consumed by the wood grain of the door, number 305. Arthur retreated to the elevator, casting one last worried glance at the lone figure sitting in the shadows of the corridor. When the elevator doors closed, George was alone again. The hours began to stretch. The storm outside intensified, the thunder rattling the windows with a violence that felt personal. The hotel creaked and groaned, settling into the night. George sat motionless. He watched the door. He watched for the slightest movement of the handle, the faintest beam of light from the crack underneath. He replayed the moment in his head over and over. The blue dress, the smile, the way she turned. It was so vivid it hurt. Around 3 a.m., the fatigue began to gnaw at him. His eyelids grew heavy. The adrenaline that had sustained him was fading, leaving behind a cold ache in his bones. He questioned his sanity. Maybe Arthur was right. Maybe the stress of the tour, the worry about Norma's health back home, she had been feeling tired lately, more than usual, had caused his mind to snap. Maybe he was just an old man chasing ghosts in a thunderstorm. He closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the chair, deciding to rest them for just a moment. And then he heard it. It was soft at first, so soft he thought it was the wind whistling through a crack in the window. But the pitch was too steady, the melody too structured. It was a humming sound, a woman's voice, low and sweet, vibrating through the air. George's eyes snapped open. He held his breath. The humming continued. It was coming from room 305. George leaned forward, straining his ears. He knew that melody. He knew every note, every pause, every breath of that song. It was "I Cross My Heart." But it wasn't his version. It wasn't the polished, studio-produced track that the world knew. It was the way Norma used to hum it in the kitchen while she was cooking, or in the truck when the radio was broken. It was off-key in the most beautiful way possible, a private rendition meant for no audience but the walls of their home. The sound defied the laws of physics. It was coming from behind a door that was sealed shut, from a room that had no air, no life, no light. Yet it was there, clear as a bell. George stood up, his legs stiff. He walked to the door again, moving slowly, reverently. He placed his palms flat against the wood. He expected it to be cold. It was warm. A gentle, radiating heat was coming through the wood, as if a fire were burning in the hearth on the other side. The humming grew slightly louder, shifting into soft singing. He could hear the words now, muffled but distinct. In all the world you'll never find a love as true as mine. Tears streamed down George's face, hot and fast. "Norma," he whispered against the door. "Norma, baby, I'm here. I'm right here." The singing didn't stop. It didn't acknowledge him. It was as if she was in her own world, a world that occupied the same space as his, but existed on a different frequency. He realized then that this wasn't a haunting. This wasn't a ghost trapped in a room. This was something else. The room wasn't empty. The room was full. It was full of a time that had passed, locked away like a preserve in a jar, and somehow, tonight, the seal had been broken just enough for him to see inside. He stayed there all night, his forehead resting against the warm wood, listening to his wife from 40 years ago singing a song that wouldn't be written for another 10 years after that moment in 1982. The paradox made his head spin, but his heart didn't care about paradoxes. His heart only knew that she was there. As the first gray light of dawn began to bleed into the hallway, diluting the shadows, the singing faded. The warmth in the wood dissipated, leaving the door cold and lifeless once more. The storm outside had broken, leaving behind a dripping, misty silence. George stepped back, his body aching, his eyes red-rimmed. He hadn't slept, but he wasn't crazy. He knew that now. He looked down at the bottom of the door. Something was sticking out. George frowned. He knelt down, his knees cracking. There, wedged between the bottom of the door and the carpet, the same spot where Arthur had shown him the undisturbed dust, was a small, white rectangle. It hadn't been there last night. With trembling fingers, George reached out and pulled it free. It was a photograph, a Polaroid. The chemical smell of the developing film was faint but present, as if it had been taken recently. But the edges were slightly yellowed. He turned it over. The image was developing, or perhaps it was already there, fading into view through the mist of time. It showed the interior of a hotel room, room 305. The furniture was different. Wicker chairs, a floral bedspread that hadn't been in style since the Reagan administration. And, sitting on the edge of the bed, laughing with a guitar in his hands, was a young George Strait. He looked barely 30. His smile was wide, his eyes full of a hunger and a joy that he hadn't felt in years. And in the corner of the frame, blurry as if she had been moving to grab the camera, was a blue sleeve. George flipped the photo over. On the back, written in blue ink in a handwriting he would recognize anywhere, Norma's handwriting, was a date. June 14th, 1982. The day we promised. George stared at the photo. June 14th, 1982. He remembered that day. That was the day they had almost quit. The day the pressure had gotten too much and they had driven to Galveston to decide if the music career was worth the toll it was taking on their marriage. They had stayed in this room. They had made a promise that day that no matter what happened, no matter how big the fame got, they would never lose us. The physical proof trembled in his hand. This wasn't a hallucination. The room had spit this out. The room was remembering. And if the room could remember the photo, maybe it could remember the door being open. George stood up, clutching the photo to his chest. He wasn't leaving. Not yet. He had to get back inside. He had to understand why the universe had opened this window now. He turned to see Arthur standing at the end of the hallway, holding a fresh cup of coffee and looking like he had seen a ghost himself. Arthur had come to check on the crazy old cowboy, expecting to find him asleep or gone. Instead, he found George Strait standing tall, eyes burning with a renewed, fierce fire, holding a piece of paper like it was a holy relic. "Arthur," George said, his voice steady and strong, the voice of the king returning. "Don't bring me coffee. Bring me my guitar case." The morning light in the hallway was cruel. It exposed the stains on the carpet, the peeling paint on the ceiling that the shadows had hidden the night before, and the deep gray exhaustion etched into George Strait's face. He sat in the velvet armchair like a sentinel who had forgotten how to leave his post. The Polaroid photograph resting on his knee. His thumb traced the white border of the image over and over, a rhythmic motion that seemed to tether him to sanity. Arthur, the night manager, who should have clocked out hours ago, stood a few feet away, his arms crossed, his posture a mix of concern and defensive skepticism. He had brought the guitar case as requested, setting it down gently, but he hadn't left. He couldn't leave. The atmosphere in the corridor was too thick, charged with a static electricity that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Arthur looked at the photo again. He had inspected it 3 times. He had held it up to the light. He had even smelled it. It defied every logical explanation he had learned in hotel management school or in his 25 years of life. "Mr. Strait," Arthur said, his voice raspy from lack of sleep, "I checked the security logs. I went down to the server room while you were sitting here. There are cameras at both ends of this hallway, motion activated." George didn't look up. And nothing triggered them," Arthur said, the fear leaking into his tone. "From the moment I left you here at 3 a.m. until I came back with the coffee, the system shows 0 movement. No guests, no staff, no one approached that door." He pointed a shaking finger at room 305. "So, unless you had that photo in your pocket the whole time, I don't know how it got there." George finally raised his eyes. They were dry, intense, burning with a quiet conviction that was more terrifying than any shout. "I didn't have it in my pocket, son, and you know it. Look at the ink." Arthur looked. The blue ink on the back, June 14th, 1982, looked wet. It wasn't, but it had that sheen of fresh ballpoint pen, the kind that smears if you touch it too soon. It hadn't faded into the dull matte of a 40-year-old inscription. "It looks fresh," Arthur admitted, whispering. "It is fresh," George said softly. "Because inside that room, it's still happening. It's still 1982. George stood up, his joints popping. He walked to the window at the end of the hall. The storm had passed, leaving behind a bruised purple sky and a churning, angry ocean. He looked out at the Gulf, letting his mind drift back to that year, 1982. It was the year before Amarillo by morning truly exploded. It was a time of terrifying transition. They were living on the edge of a cliff. One side was obscurity and debt. The other was a level of fame that would consume their privacy forever. He remembered the drive down to Galveston that day, the silence in the truck. Norma had been crying, silently, looking out the window at the passing telephone poles. She was afraid. She was afraid that the music business would turn him into someone she didn't know, that the bright lights would blind him to the simple life they cherished. They had come to the Hotel Galvez to save their marriage, to make a pact. He turned back to the door. That room, room 305, was where they had made the pact. They had sat on the floor, eating room service burgers because they were too tired to go down to the restaurant, and he had sworn to her that he would always be George first and the king of country second, though nobody called him that back then. "She's waiting for me to keep the promise," George murmured to himself. "Sir?" Arthur asked. "Nothing," George said. He walked back to the chair and sat down, picking up the guitar case. He set it on his lap and unlatched the bronze clasps. Click, click, click. The sound was loud in the quiet hallway. He opened the lid. Inside lay his guitar, a beautiful instrument of rosewood and spruce, its body polished to a shine. It was an extension of his soul. He hadn't played it in 24 hours, and his fingers itched for the strings. "What are you going to do?" Arthur asked, taking a step back. You can't just break the door down with a guitar." "I tried force," George said, lifting the instrument out of its velvet bed. He strummed a G chord. The sound was rich and full, resonating against the high ceilings of the hotel corridor. It sounded different here, louder, more urgent. "Force didn't work. The door is fused, you said, sealed with epoxy, a physical barrier." He began to tune the low E string, his ear tilted toward the neck of the guitar. "But this isn't a physical problem, Arthur. This is a spiritual one. That photo didn't slide under the door because of physics. It came through because of a connection." He looked at the door. The wood looked mundane now in the daylight. Just a beat-up old door with a number plate that was slightly crooked. But George knew better. He knew that behind it lay the most precious thing he had ever lost: time. "I have to wait for night," George decided, placing the guitar back in the open case but leaving the lid up. "The veil is thinner at night. That's when she came out. That's when she sang." The day passed in an agonizingly slow blur. Arthur eventually had to leave to attend to his duties, though he returned every hour, bringing water, a sandwich that George didn't touch, and anxious glances. The hotel staff whispered. The maids gave the third floor a wide berth. Rumors began to circulate that George Strait was having a breakdown in the West Wing, that he was grieving, that he was writing a masterpiece. They weren't entirely wrong, and they weren't entirely right. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, stretching shadows down the corridor, the atmosphere shifted again. The air pressure dropped. The smell of ozone returned, even though the sky outside was relatively clear. The silence of the hotel deepened, the ambient noise of the city fading away, until it felt like the hotel was drifting in a void. George picked up the guitar. He checked the tuning again. Perfect. He stood up and approached the door. He stood 2 feet away, close enough to touch it, but he kept his hands on the instrument. He closed his eyes and focused. He didn't think about the crowds in the Astrodome. He didn't think about the platinum records on his wall. He thought about Norma. He thought about the smell of her perfume, vanilla and rain. He thought about the way her hand felt in his, small but capable of steering his entire life. He needed to play the song she was humming last night, "I Cross My Heart," but he couldn't play it like a superstar. He had to play it like a man making a vow. He struck the first chord. The sound didn't just travel through the air, it seemed to ripple through the walls. The hallway acted as a sound box, amplifying the acoustic notes, wrapping them in a warm reverb. "Our love is unconditional. We knew it from the start." George sang the opening line. His voice was rougher than usual, stripped of all production, raw and vulnerable. He wasn't singing for an audience. He was singing for an audience of one. He watched the door as he played. At first, nothing happened. The wood remained dead. The epoxy in the lock remained black and solid. He kept playing. He poured 40 years of love and regret and gratitude into the melody. He remembered the fights they had resolved, the children they had raised, the grief they had shared when they lost their daughter. He put all that pain into the strings. The music became a physical force, a key turning in a lock that wasn't made of metal. I cross my heart and promise to give all I've got to give. Then he saw it. The golden light returned. It started as a thin line at the bottom of the door, pushing back the shadows of the hallway. Then it began to seep through the cracks in the frame, glowing brighter and brighter until the outline of the door was traced in fire. The air in the hallway grew warm, smelling suddenly of sea salt and hot pavement, the smell of a Galveston summer afternoon. Arthur, who had just stepped off the elevator with a tray of dinner, dropped the tray. The clatter of silverware was lost under the swelling sound of the guitar. He stared, mouth open, as the reality of the hotel corridor seemed to warp. The walls around the door shimmered like a mirage on a highway. George didn't stop playing. He knew that if he stopped, the connection would break. He walked closer until the headstock of his guitar was inches from the wood. He could feel the vibration of the door now, humming in sympathy with his strings. The epoxy in the lock didn't melt. It simply ceased to be relevant. The heavy brass handle turned, all by itself. Click. The sound was as loud as a gunshot. The door creaked inward. George stopped singing, letting the final chord ring out and fade into the heavy air. He lowered the guitar to his side, holding it by the neck like a weapon or a shield. The door was open. Inside, it wasn't dark. It was bathed in the warm, amber glow of sunset. Even though it was night outside in the hallway, the air rushing out was cool and conditioned, smelling of room service fries and cheap hotel soap. George took a breath. It was the air of 1982. He looked back at Arthur. The young manager was pressed against the wall, his eyes wide with terror and awe. George gave him a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of the witness. "Don't let the door close behind me, son," George said quietly. "Mr. Straight," Arthur whispered, unable to form a sentence. George turned back to the light. He stepped over the threshold. The transition was instantaneous and disorienting. One moment he was standing on the plush, worn carpet of the 2024 hallway. The next, his boots sank into a shag rug that was a vibrant, tacky orange. The silence of the hallway was replaced by the low hum of a window air conditioner unit rattling in its frame. A radio in the corner was playing softly, a Willie Nelson song, "Always on My Mind," which was topping the charts that year. George stood in the entryway of the room, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might fail. The room was messy. Clothes were scattered on the chairs, his clothes, but smaller, tighter fits. A pair of Wranglers he hadn't owned in decades. A pack of cigarettes on the nightstand he had quit years ago. And there, standing by the window, looking out at the ocean, which was calm and bathed in orange sunlight, was Norma. She turned. The breath left George's body. She was 28 years old. Her skin was flawless, glowing with the tan she had picked up on the ranch. Her hair was dark, thick, pulled back in that simple ribbon. She was wearing the blue dress. She held a half-eaten burger in one hand and a glass of iced tea in the other. She looked at him, but she didn't look at him with the recognition of a wife seeing her husband return from the bathroom. She frowned, her head tilting to the side. She looked at his gray hair. She looked at the lines on his face. She looked at the expensive, custom-made boots he was wearing, so different from the scuffed work boots he had owned back then. She didn't scream. She didn't panic. There was a deep, intuitive wisdom in Norma's eyes that had always unsettled him. She looked at him, and then she looked at the guitar in his hand, the Martin D45 that he wouldn't buy until 1995. "George?" she asked. Her voice was higher, lighter, untouched by the years. "It's me, Norma," George choked out, tears instantly blurring his vision. He took a step forward, but stopped. He felt huge in the room, like a giant trying not to crush a dollhouse. "It's me." Norma set the burger down on the windowsill. She wiped her hands on a napkin, her eyes never leaving his face. She walked toward him, slowly, studying him. She stopped a foot away. She reached out a hand and touched his cheek. Her fingers were warm, solid, real. This wasn't a hologram. This was flesh and blood. "You look old, George," she whispered, a tremble entering her voice. "You look so old. What happened? Did something bad happen? Did we lose the ranch?" George laughed, a wet, broken sound. He shook his head. "No, baby, we didn't lose the ranch. We didn't lose anything." He covered her hand with his own, pressing it against his weathered cheek. I'm from a long way down the road. I'm from tomorrow. A lot of tomorrows." Norma searched his eyes. She saw the love there, the same love she felt, but deepened, widened, like a river that had carved a canyon over centuries. She looked at the open door behind him, where the dark, stormy hallway of 2024 was visible, a gaping maw of the future. Then she looked back at him. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Did I die? Is that why you're here? To say goodbye?" George felt a chill run through him. The fear in her voice broke his heart. "No," he said firmly. "No, you're alive. You're waiting for me at home. You're safe." "Then why?" she asked, tears spilling over her lashes now. "Why did the door open? Why are you looking at me like you haven't seen me in 100 years?" "Because I needed to remember," George said, his voice cracking. "I needed to remember who we were before the world got its hands on us. I needed to remember this room, this night. Do you know what night this is, Norma?" She nodded slowly. "It's the night we decide whether to keep going or to quit." "We kept going," George said, looking deep into her eyes. "We kept going, Norma, and it was a ride. Lord, it was a ride. But I got tired. Tonight, in my time, I was just so tired, and I needed to know if we made the right choice." Norma stepped closer, wrapping her arms around his waist. She buried her face in his chest. He smelled the shampoo she used to buy at the drugstore for 99 cents. He wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her neck, holding on to the ghost of his past, who was, in this impossible moment, the most real thing in the universe. "Did we be happy, George?" she asked into his shirt. "Did we stay us?" George closed his eyes, rocking her gently, the same way they had danced in 1,000 honky-tonks. "We stayed us, honey. We stayed us. But I forgot to tell you something. Something I should have told you every day for 40 years, and I think I missed a few." "What?" she asked, looking up at him. "That you were the music," George said, his voice trembling. "The songs were just the job. You were the music, and I think I came back just to hear the song one more time from the beginning." Outside in the hallway, Arthur watched. He couldn't hear their words, but he saw the embrace. He saw the impossible collision of youth and age, of past and present. He saw the light from the room spilling out, bathing the old cowboy in a grace that felt holy. But then, the light began to flicker. The edges of the doorframe began to vibrate. The hum of the air conditioner inside the room started to distort, stretching into a low, menacing groan. The loop was unstable. The universe was correcting itself. "Mr. Straight!" Arthur yelled, stepping forward but afraid to cross the threshold. "The door! It's closing!" George heard the shout. He felt the room shudder around them. The orange sunlight in the window began to strobe, flashing between day and night. Norma pulled back, looking around in confusion. "You have to go," she said, panic rising in her eyes. "George, you can't stay here. You don't belong here anymore." "I don't want to go," George said, gripping her shoulders. "I just got here." "You have to," Norma said, pushing him firmly. She was strong. She had always been the strong one. "Go back to me, the old me. She needs you more than I do. I have the young George. He's in the bathroom washing his face. He's about to come out and tell me he wants to be a star. You have to go back to the one who's waiting for you." The door began to swing shut, fighting against an invisible wind. "Norma!" George cried, desperation seizing him. "Go!" she shouted, shoving him toward the dark hallway. "And George?" He turned back, 1 foot in 1982, 1 foot in 2024. "Tell me I was worth it," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Tell the old me it was worth it." "Everything," George choked out. "You were everything." With a violent lurch, the timeline snapped. George stumbled backward into the cold, dark corridor of the present. He fell hard onto the carpet, clutching his guitar. Slam! The door to room 305 slammed shut with a force that shook the entire third floor. The golden light vanished instantly. The smell of ozone returned. The silence of the night came crashing back down. George lay on the floor, gasping for breath, staring at the closed door. Arthur ran to him, helping him sit up. "Are you okay, Mr. Straight? Are you okay?" George didn't answer. He stared at the door. It looked old again, dead. But his hand, his left hand, was clenched tight. He opened his fingers. In his palm lay a small, silver object. It wasn't the Polaroid. It was a ring. A simple silver band with a small turquoise stone. Norma's favorite ring from 1982. The one she had lost on the beach that very trip. She had cried for 2 days about it. They had searched the sand for hours and never found it. The room hadn't just given him a memory. It had returned what the ocean had stolen. George looked at the ring, then at the door, and finally at Arthur. A slow, sad smile spread across his face, but his eyes were filled with a peace that hadn't been there when he checked in. "I have to make a call," George whispered, his voice raspy but filled with a new strength. "I have to call my wife." The hallway was silent, the kind of silence that follows a thunderclap, where the ears are still ringing with the phantom noise of the explosion. George sat on the floor, his legs sprawled out in an ungraceful V. The neck of his Martin guitar clutched in his right hand like a lifeline. In his left palm, the silver turquoise ring felt heavy, dense with a gravity that belied its small size. It was cool to the touch, yet it seemed to pulse against his skin, a rhythmic thrumming that matched the beat of his own heart. Arthur, the young night manager, was on his knees beside him. He didn't touch George. He simply stared at the ring, then at the door, then back at the ring. His face was a mask of shock. He had seen the light. He had heard the voice. But seeing the physical object, a ring that, by all accounts, should have been buried under 4 decades of sand and tide, shattered the last remnants of his skepticism. "Is that—" Arthur started, his voice cracking. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Is that the ring you told me about? The one she lost?" George nodded slowly. He didn't look up. He was busy memorizing the imperfections in the turquoise stone. The tiny scratch on the silver band that he remembered Norma making when she caught it on a screen door in Pearsall in 1981. "It's the one," George whispered. "She was wearing it, inside, and when I let go, when the time snapped, she must have slipped it into my hand." He closed his fist tight, protecting the metal as if it might evaporate like smoke. "She knew," George said, a realization dawning on him, widening his eyes. "The young Norma, she knew I was coming back to the future. She sent this as a receipt, proof that it wasn't a dream." "Mr. Straight, maybe we should get you to your suite," Arthur suggested gently. "You look pale. You've been up all night." George let Arthur help him stand. His knees were stiff, his back aching with the dull throb of age that the room had briefly made him forget. He looked at door 305 one last time. It was just a door again. The wood was dull, the number plate crooked, the epoxy and the lock black and hard. The magic had receded, retreating into the walls of the Hotel Galvez, waiting for another storm, another desperate soul, or perhaps waiting for never. Some doors, George knew, only open once. He didn't say goodbye to the door. He simply nodded to it, a gesture of respect between two keepers of secrets. He turned and walked down the long corridor to room 302, his boots heavy on the carpet. Arthur walked him to the threshold but didn't cross it. "I'll bring you some breakfast, sir," Arthur said. "On the house. Anything you want." "Just coffee, son," George said. "Black. And a pen. I need a pen." Inside the suite, the air was still and neutral. It lacked the electric charge of the hallway. George set the guitar case down on the bed and walked to the window. The sun was beginning to breach the horizon, a bruised purple line turning into a bleeding orange. The Gulf of Mexico was calming down, the whitecaps settling into a rhythmic, rolling swell. The storm was over. "Preserve the original language of the text in the corner." He placed the turquoise ring in the center of the blotter. He stared at it for a long time. Then he took the hotel stationery, thick, cream-colored paper with the Hotel Galvez logo embossed at the top, and the pen Arthur had provided. He didn't go to sleep. He couldn't. His mind was a whirlwind of melody and memory. He picked up the guitar again, resting it on his knee, and began to pick a tune. It wasn't "I Cross My Heart." It was something new, something slower, sadder, but filled with a rugged hope. He hummed, finding the words in the air, pulling them down and pinning them to the paper. The storm rolled in on a Tuesday night, brought the ghosts and the golden light. I saw you there in a dress of blue, the girl I loved, the girl I knew. He scratched out a line, rewrote it. He worked for 2 hours, the coffee Arthur brought going cold on the nightstand. He wrote about the door that shouldn't open. He wrote about the promise made in 1982. He wrote about the ring returned by the tide of time. It was the most honest thing he had written in 20 years. It wasn't a song for the radio. It wasn't a song for the charts. It was a letter to his wife, said to the rhythm of a heartbeat. When the sun was fully up, flooding the room with a harsh, revealing daylight, George set the pen down. He picked up the ring and slid it onto his pinky finger. It only went down to the first knuckle. He smiled. He looked at the clock. 7:30 a.m. Norma would be awake. She was an early riser, a habit from the ranch that never died. She would be in the kitchen in San Antonio, making coffee, looking out at the hill country, wondering why he hadn't called the night before. George reached for his cell phone. His hand trembled slightly as he dialed the number. He held the phone to his ear, listening to the ringback tone. 1 ring, 2 rings. "Hello?" Her voice, the real voice, older, deeper, raspy with mourning, but undeniably her. It washed over him like a warm blanket. "Norma?" George said. He had to stop, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Morning, honey." "George?" Norma sounded concerned instantly. She knew his voice better than anyone. She heard the tremor. "Is everything okay? You sound different. Where are you? Did the storm hit you bad?" "I'm in Galveston," George said, leaning back in the chair, closing his eyes. "I'm at the Galvez. The storm it was something, all right." "Why are you at the Galvez? I thought you were driving straight through." "I had to stop," George said. "I had to stop and pick something up." "Pick what up? At a hotel?" George took a deep breath. He looked at the ring on his finger. "Do you remember the trip we took here in '82? The one where we almost quit?" There was a silence on the other end of the line, a long pause. "I remember," Norma said softly. "I remember it like it was yesterday." "Why?" "Do you remember what you lost that weekend?" "George, I lost a lot of sleep that weekend," she chuckled, though the laugh was nervous. "No, on the beach, the turquoise ring, the one your daddy gave you." "Of course I remember," Norma sighed. "I cried for a week. I loved that ring. Why are you bringing up old sadness, George?" "Because," George said, his voice steadying, becoming firm and sure, "I found it." "You... what?" "I found it, Norma. It was waiting for me, here at the hotel." "George, that's impossible," Norma said, her voice sharp with disbelief. "That was 40 years ago. It's buried under 10 feet of sand, or washed out to sea." "It wasn't in the sand," George said. "It was in room 305. "Room 305? Norma paused. "That was our room. But how?" "I can't explain it on the phone," George said. "I don't think I can explain it at all. But I have it. I'm holding it right now. And Norma?" "Yes?" "I saw you." "What do you mean, you saw me?" "I saw you in the blue dress with the daisies. I saw you eating a burger by the window. I saw you looking at me with eyes that didn't know how old I'd get." George let a tear slide down his cheek, unashamed. "And you told me to come back. You told me to come back to the you that's waiting for me now." On the other end of the line, there was silence. Then, the soft sound of a breath hitching. Norma didn't ask if he was drunk. She didn't ask if he was crazy. They had lived a life full of miracles. The miracle of fame, the miracle of family, the miracle of survival. She knew in her bones when he was speaking the truth. "Come home, George," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Just come home." "I'm coming," George said. "Put the coffee on. I'm bringing the ring, and I'm bringing a new song. I love you, cowboy. I love you, Norma. More than time." He hung up the phone. The silence in the room was no longer heavy. It was peaceful. It was the silence of a debt paid. A circle closed. George packed his bag. He placed the handwritten lyrics in his guitar case, tucking them safely beneath the neck of the instrument. He put on his hat, adjusting the brim in the mirror. The face looking back at him was old, yes. The lines were deep. The eyes were tired. But there was a fire in them that hadn't been there yesterday. It was the fire of a man who knows that the past isn't dead. It's just a room down the hall. He took the elevator down to the lobby. The hotel was waking up. Guests were checking out, complaining about the thunder, asking about breakfast. The mundane world had reasserted its control. Arthur was still at the front desk. He looked exhausted, his tie loosened, his eyes red. When he saw George emerging from the elevator, he straightened up, smoothing his hair. George walked up to the desk. He placed the heavy brass key to room 302 on the marble counter. "Checking out, Mr. Straight?" Arthur asked, his voice formal, but his eyes searching George's face for a sign. "Checking out, Arthur," George said. "Everything is settled." Arthur hesitated. The room upstairs, room 305. I went back up there a few minutes ago, just to check." "And?" "It's sealed tight," Arthur said. dust on the floor like nobody has touched it in 10 years. George smiled. That's how it should be. Don't go digging, son. Let it sleep. George reached into his pocket. He pulled out the Polaroid photo, the one of young George and the blur of the blue dress. He placed it on the counter, face down. Keep that, George said. Remind yourself that physics doesn't know everything about love. Arthur picked up the photo. He looked at it, his eyes widening again. Mr. Straight, are you sure? I don't need the picture, George said, tapping the side of his head. I got the memory, and I got the ring. He held up his hand, the turquoise stone flashing in the chandelier light. Thank you, sir, Arthur said, clutching the photo like a treasure. For everything. I don't think anyone will believe me. They don't have to, George said. You believe it. That's enough. George tipped his hat, picked up his guitar case, and turned toward the revolving doors. The sunlight outside was blinding, washing out the gloom of the lobby. He stepped out into the humid Galveston morning. The air smelled of salt and exhaust and wet pavement. He walked to his black truck, throwing his gear into the passenger seat. He climbed into the driver's side, the leather seat creaking familiarly. He started the engine. The truck roared to life, a deep, guttural growl. He put it in gear and pulled out of the parking lot, turning onto the seawall boulevard. To his left, the ocean stretched out to infinity, glittering like diamonds. To his right, the Hotel Galvez stood like a fortress, a white sentinel guarding the secrets of the coast. George glanced at the third-floor windows in his rearview mirror. He found the one that corresponded to room 305. The curtains were drawn. It looked dark, empty. But George knew better. He turned on the radio. A young country singer was singing about trucks and beer. George turned it down. He began to hum the melody he had written that morning. The tires hummed against the asphalt, joining the song. I cross my heart. He wasn't just driving home. He was driving back to the present, carrying a piece of the past in his pocket. The road ahead was dusty, stretching all the way back to the ranch, back to reality, back to the slow, steady march of time. But George Strait wasn't afraid of time anymore. He knew now that love was the one thing that time couldn't erode. It could bend it, it could twist it, it could hide it behind a sealed door, but it couldn't kill it. He pressed the gas pedal, the truck surging forward. He had a ring to deliver, he had a wife to kiss, and he had a song to sing. The king of country smiled, his eyes fixed on the horizon. As the Hotel Galvez faded into the mist behind him, just a memory, just a ghost, just an echo of a love that refused to die.